We had an agreement. I expect you to honor it and keep your men away from my livestock.
The wind whipped across the dry plains, carrying the scent of dust and wild sage, rustling the wooden slats of the old corral. At the edge of the horizon, a lone wagon creaked its way along the rutted trail, its wheels grumbling like tired men. Silas Grayson, the rancher, leaned against the splintered fence post, squinting into the sun's glare. He had been waiting for weeks for the letter that promised a companion. A mail-order bride sent from the east. He had pictured a slender woman with delicate hands and quiet manners. Someone to ease the lonesome nights on the sprawling land he called his own. But as the wagon drew nearer, a shape emerged, larger, more imposing than any figure he had imagined. Silas adjusted his hat, trying to hide the twitch of unease creeping over his face. He had built his life on hard work and solitude, and he knew the plains did not tolerate weakness. His ranch stretched for miles, an unforgiving patch of earth that demanded every ounce of grit and sweat. It was a place where dreams were forged by the strength of one's back, not the softness of one's words. And yet, the thought of having someone by his side, someone who could share in the quiet victories and stubborn failures, had kept him going through lonely winters and scorching summers. The wagon halted with a jolt, sending a puff of dust into the air. Silas watched as the driver, a wiry old man with a crooked smile, lifted the canvas flap and called out, "She's here. Your bride has arrived." Silas's pulse quickened. He stepped forward, boots crunching on the gravel, and squinted at the figure climbing down. She moved with a confidence that seemed to fill the space around her, a presence that Silas could feel in the bones of the earth itself. When she finally reached the ground, he saw her fully for the first time. She was unlike any woman he had imagined. Her frame was broad and sturdy, a body that spoke of strength rather than fragility. Her eyes, however, were sharp, bright, and full of fire, and they met his without a hint of fear. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice firm and steady, carrying across the yard like the ringing of a bell. "I am Juliet Thorne. You must be Mr. Grayson." Silas swallowed hard, trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the letters he had received. Every description had been careful, measured, written to paint a picture of demure beauty. And yet Juliet Thorne stood before him. A woman twice the size of any he had envisioned, radiating a confidence that made the air seem heavier. His throat tightened. How would this work? Could the quiet rhythm of ranch life, the endless chores and harsh winters, ever accommodate someone like her? Juliet took a step closer, and Silas noticed the subtle grace in her movements, the ease with which she handled herself. "I know this is unexpected," she said, her lips curling into a hint of a smile. "But I am here because I chose to be, not because I am a picture on paper. I can work, I can ride, and I can endure. I hope that counts for something." Silas nodded, though he wasn't sure whether it was agreement or mere politeness. The truth was, he was caught off guard, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. For years he had told himself he wanted a companion, someone to soften the edges of his solitary world. Yet now, faced with the reality, his heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Could he accept someone so different from the image he had conjured in his mind? The ranch seemed to hold its breath. The wind stilled for a moment, as if waiting for his answer. He gestured toward the corral, and Juliet followed, her boots sinking slightly into the packed dirt. The horses snorted and pawed the ground, sensing a new energy in the air. Silas watched her as she surveyed the property, noting how her gaze lingered on the barns, the fenced pastures, the wide-open spaces that stretched to the horizon. It was a look of calculation, of someone weighing the land, as if measuring whether it could bend to her will or whether she would bend to it. "She's strong," Silas muttered under his breath, mostly to himself. He did not mean muscle alone, though her frame certainly spoke of physical power. No, he meant she had strength in her spirit, a kind of resilience that could either clash with his own stubbornness or complement it in ways he had not yet imagined. Juliet turned toward him. Noticing the slight tension in his stance, "I don't intend to disrupt your life, Mr. Grayson. I only want to help build it, if you'll let me." Silas cleared his throat, uncertain what to say. He had spent years perfecting routines, controlling every aspect of his domain. The thought of introducing someone so bold, so unshakable, into that world was daunting, and yet a part of him stirred with curiosity, a quiet thrill at the idea that perhaps life could be more than isolation and labor. The driver of the wagon coughed and shifted his weight. "I'll leave you two to settle things," he said, tipping his hat. With a creak of the wheels and a shout at the horses, he turned the wagon back toward the trail. Leaving only dust and the fading sound of hooves behind, Silas watched the trail, then looked back at Juliet. She was already examining the barn doors, tapping on the wood as though assessing its strength. "You can start with the chores if you like," he said finally, his voice roughened by years of disuse and casual conversation. "Or you can sit down and tell me who you really are. Either way, we'll see if this works." Juliet's smile widened, not teasing, but certain, confident. "I think I'll do both," she replied. "It seems a fair way to begin." For a long moment they stood in silence, the sun casting long shadows over the rugged land. The wind stirred again, whispering secrets through the prairie grass. Silas could feel the weight of expectations pressing down, not just his own, but those of the land, of the life he had fought so hard to claim. And in that moment, he realized that this encounter, unplanned and unpredictable, might change everything. The air was heavy with questions. How would she fit into his life? Into the rigid rhythms of ranch work? Would her strength complement his, or would it challenge him in ways he could not yet imagine? And most pressing of all, could a man who had built his world on solitude open his heart to someone so larger than life? Someone who refused to fit neatly into the mold he had imagined for companionship. Juliet stepped closer, breaking his reverie. "I didn't come all this way to be underestimated," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I came to stand beside you, if you'll have me, and I promise I don't back down from work or hardship." Silas nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. Yet inside, he felt the stirrings of doubt, of challenge, and of something he had not expected: excitement. The kind of thrill that comes when the unknown approaches, when life shifts on its axis and the horizon seems both promising and dangerous. He motioned toward the house. "Then we better start somewhere," he said. "The wind doesn't wait for anyone, and neither do the cattle." Juliet followed, her steps measured and sure. But even as they moved together across the sun-baked earth, Silas could not shake the unease. The anticipation that something about this meeting would either ignite a fire or shatter the careful life he had built. The ranch stretched out endlessly behind them, open and unforgiving. And somewhere deep in the rolling plains, the wind seemed to whisper a warning. Life was about to change, and no one knew how far the consequences would reach as the sun dipped lower, casting long golden streaks across the land. Silas realized that waiting alone was over. Juliet Thorne had arrived, bold, larger than life, and entirely unpredictable. The plains would test them both, in body, spirit, and heart. And in the quiet of the approaching night, a question lingered. Heavy as the scent of sage in the air, could a man who had thrived on solitude truly embrace a woman who defied every expectation he had ever held? The wind blew harder, carrying with it dust, anticipation, and the unspoken promise of a story yet to unfold. Silas Grayson and Juliet Thorne stood at the threshold of change, neither knowing where the path would lead. Only one thing was certain: the old ways of life on the ranch were about to meet a force as untamed as the prairie itself. The sun had barely sunk below the horizon when Silas led Juliet Thorne into the small wooden house that had stood on the edge of the Grayson Ranch for more than 20 years. The building smelled of old timber and smoke, a comforting scent for someone who had spent his life working with the land. The floorboards creaked beneath their boots, and the fading light from the window caught on the rough grain of the walls. Silas paused in the doorway, letting Juliet take in her surroundings. "I built this place myself," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Every nail, every board. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine." Juliet's eyes roamed the room, noting the simple furnishings: a sturdy wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a small hearth blackened with years of fire. She ran her hand along the edge of the table, feeling the grooves and dents left by time and work. "It suits you," she said, her voice steady. "Simple, strong, honest. That's how a home should feel." Silas raised an eyebrow. Few people ever commented on his home without criticism. The words surprised him, and for a moment he allowed himself to hope that Juliet might be different from those who had come and gone before. She had an honesty about her, an openness that both unnerved and intrigued him. "I hope you're ready," he said, breaking the quiet. "This ranch, it doesn't wait for anyone. There's work from sunrise to sunset. Cattle to feed, fences to mend, the land itself to wrestle with." Juliet smiled, a small curl of her lips that seemed to promise determination rather than fear. "I can handle it," she said simply. "I didn't come all this way to hide behind a fireplace. I came to stand beside you, to be part of this life." Silas nodded, feeling a mix of admiration and apprehension. Her words were bold, and yet they carried a weight that made him wonder what had brought her to this point. He had received letters describing her carefully, painting a picture of a quiet, gentle woman. Juliet Thorne was none of that. She carried herself with the certainty of someone who had faced storms and walked through them without breaking. As the night deepened, they ate a simple supper of bread and salted meat. Sitting across from each other at the table, Silas studied her as she ate, noting the careful movements of her hands, the way her eyes lingered on the shadows in the room, and the flicker of thought behind her gaze. There was a story here. He realized a past that had shaped her, made her strong, and perhaps brought her to this remote corner of the plains. "I didn't always live like this," Juliet said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "I grew up in the East, in a city that never stopped moving. Life was different there, loud, crowded, unforgiving in its own way. I learned early that you had to be big to survive or you wouldn't last." Silas leaned back, listening. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the shadows danced across her face. There was a vulnerability hidden beneath her strength, a part of her that no one had written in any letter. He felt a twinge of curiosity, mixed with caution. People rarely arrived on his doorstep carrying both fire and scars. "I see," he said finally. "So you're used to fighting for yourself." "I am," she replied, her gaze steady. "And I'm used to being judged before anyone really sees me. I'm tired of it. I want a chance to be more than what people expect. That's why I answered your letter." Silas remained quiet, letting her words sink in. He had built walls around himself, not just from the harshness of the land, but from people. Trust did not come easily, and companionship had always seemed like a fragile thing, too easy to break. And yet he could sense that Juliet Thorne was not fragile. She was the kind of woman who could face the merciless wind of the plains and stand unshaken. The night stretched on, and the wind howled against the windows. Outside, the cattle shifted restlessly, their low calls echoing across the darkening fields. Silas felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, and the presence of Juliet Thorne beside him only intensified the awareness of change. She had arrived as a mystery, a force he could neither predict nor control, and that both terrified and thrilled him. In the days that followed, Silas began to show Juliet the rhythms of ranch life. They rode together across the wide stretches of land, checking fences, guiding cattle, and tending to the horses. He watched her closely, noting how she adapted quickly, her strength a match for the labor that had once seemed too heavy for anyone else. She lifted bales of hay with ease, her boots sinking into the dust, and moved among the animals with a calm confidence that belied her size. Yet for all her capability, there were moments when Juliet Thorne's gaze would drift toward the horizon, as if she were measuring something beyond the ranch, something only she could see. Silas noticed it, the small hints of something unresolved, a shadow in her otherwise determined demeanor. He wondered what she had left behind in the east. What secrets traveled with her on that long journey across the plains? One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned to burnished gold, Silas found her standing at the edge of the pasture, watching the wind stir the tall grass. "You're quiet," he said, dismounting from his horse and walking toward her. "I'm thinking," she said, her eyes still on the horizon. "There's so much to consider when you start anew. The land, the work, the people, and yet there's something else. Something I can't name yet, but it's there, and I feel it." Silas studied her in the fading light. There was a depth to her that he could not penetrate, a layer of mystery that made her presence both magnetic and disquieting. He realized then that her arrival was more than just a change in routine. She had brought with her a current of uncertainty, a force that would challenge him in ways he could not yet anticipate. "I've spent my life on this land," he said finally. "I know every inch of it, every risk it carries. And I know that nothing comes easy here. But maybe," he added, almost reluctantly, "maybe a person like you can change the way I see it." Juliet turned to him, the fire of determination in her eyes brighter than the setting sun. "Maybe we can change it together," she said softly, yet firmly. Silas nodded, though the unease lingered. There was a pull between them, a tension born of expectation and reality, of hope and doubt. He had waited for a companion, but the arrival of Juliet Thorne had brought something far more unpredictable. She was a woman who would not conform to his plans, his imagination, or the lonely life he had meticulously built. And perhaps, he thought, with a mix of dread and anticipation, that was exactly what he needed. As night fell and the stars appeared above the endless plains, the wind carrying whispers across the land, Silas Grayson felt the first real tremor of change. Juliet Thorne had arrived, bringing with her strength, mystery, and the promise of the unknown. The ranch, once quiet and predictable, now seemed alive with possibility and danger alike. He knew that life on the Grayson Ranch would never be the same. The work would be harder, the days longer, and yet, for the first time in years, he felt the spark of something he had forgotten, the thrill of uncertainty, the stirrings of connection, and the pulse of life breaking through the monotony of solitude. But even as he watched Juliet Thorne move through the shadows of the pasture, he could not shake the feeling that she carried secrets, and that the land itself had a way of revealing them in its own time. The wind sighed through the grass, a reminder that the plains demanded respect, resilience, and courage. Silas knew he would have to rise to the challenge, not just as a rancher, but as a man confronting change he had never expected. The night deepened, and the quiet hum of the prairie settled around them. Juliet's shadow stretched long across the dust, bold and unyielding. Silas Grayson felt the pull of uncertainty, knowing that the days ahead would test both their strengths, reveal hidden truths, and perhaps uncover mysteries neither of them were ready to face. The horizon waited, endless and untamed, carrying the promise of storm's secrets, and a life that would never be the same. And so, the ranch, the land, and the two souls standing on its edge were poised on the brink of something vast, uncertain, and impossible to ignore. Neither knew what the coming days would bring, only that the arrival of Juliet Thorne had set in motion a story that could not be undone, a story written in dust, sweat, and the unforgiving winds of the prairie. The dawn broke pale and sharp over the Grayson Ranch, painting the prairie with streaks of silver and gold. Silas Grayson had been awake long before the sun, moving among the pens to check the cattle, the familiar rhythm of his work both comforting and relentless. Yet the thought of Juliet Thorne lingered at the edge of his mind, like a shadow that would not be ignored. He had seen her handle the chores with strength and precision, yet there was a quiet storm in her gaze, a tension that promised upheaval. He wondered what lay behind it and whether the land itself would bend to the force she carried with her by mid-morning. Juliet had made her way to the barn, humming a low tune that sounded almost like a challenge. The horses watched her, nostrils flaring, muscles coiling beneath sleek coats. She moved among them as if she belonged to the wild in a way Silas never had. She was larger than most women he had known. Yet there was a grace in her movements, a deliberate control that made the work she did seem effortless. Silas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying her. He admired her, yet the sight of her independence stirred unease. This woman would not follow instructions blindly, and he could feel the pull of conflict already forming between their wills. "You're thinking too much," she said suddenly, looking up at him with those fiery eyes. "You can't plan for everything. The land doesn't care about your plans, and neither do I." Her words struck him like a whip. He opened his mouth to respond, but found himself momentarily disarmed. How had he ever imagined a companion would be easy, quiet, predictable? Juliet Thorne was none of those things. She was a force unto herself, and it was impossible not to feel the pull of both admiration and fear. As they worked side by side, the tension between them grew, threaded with unspoken questions. Juliet had come with her own past, hints of which she let slip in moments of quiet reflection. She spoke occasionally of the East, of a life crowded with noise, judgment, and struggle, yet never fully revealing what had driven her to leave everything behind. Silas listened, recognizing in her words a hardness that mirrored his own. Yet he wondered how much of it was a shield, and how much was truth waiting to emerge. The days passed, and each dawn brought new challenges. A sudden storm rolled over the plains one afternoon, forcing Silas and Juliet to secure the barn doors against the wind and rain. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating her determined face as she moved with swift, confident hands. Silas felt both awe and apprehension. She was strong, but the storm was relentless, and he realized that her presence would push him to face challenges he had long avoided, not just the physical trials of the land, but the harder terrain of trust and compromise. Meanwhile, there were whispers in the town nearby, subtle but unmistakable. Word of Juliet Thorne had reached ears that preferred caution over curiosity. Some admired her boldness. Others questioned her motives. A man at the general store muttered under his breath about the strange mail-order bride. It was larger than expected and seemed unshakable. Silas overheard fragments of conversations, felt the weight of judgment pressing in from beyond the ranch. It was a reminder that life on the plains was never entirely solitary. Even in isolation, one could not escape the gaze of others. Juliet, however, seemed unconcerned with gossip. She focused on the ranch, on the work, and on learning the rhythm of Silas's life. Yet in quiet moments, she would pause at the edge of the prairie, staring into the horizon as if searching for something she had left behind. Silas noticed it, a flicker of mystery that deepened the tension between them. What secrets did she carry, and how would they affect the fragile trust they were beginning to build? One evening, as the sun sank low and the prairie turned molten gold, a rider appeared on the distant trail. Silas squinted, trying to make out the figure. The rider drew closer, kicking up dust that trailed behind like a ghost. Silas felt a ripple of unease. Strangers rarely traveled these roads without reason. He watched as the rider slowed near the edge of the property, dismounting with careful precision. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single glance. Juliet noticed the movement first and stepped beside Silas, hand brushing against his arm in silent alert. "We might have company," she said. Her tone was calm, but there was a tension beneath it, recognition that the plains often carried danger disguised as routine. The rider approached cautiously, tipping his hat. "Evening," he said, his voice low. "Name's Garrett Hollis. I hear there's new blood at the Grayson Ranch." Silas narrowed his eyes. "You heard right," he said. "And what's your business here, Hollis?" Garrett's eyes flicked to Juliet, then back to Silas. "Business. Maybe, or maybe curiosity," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "A woman like her doesn't come to the plains without a reason." Juliet stiffened, her hand moving instinctively to her side, though she carried nothing more than confidence. Silas noticed the tension and stepped forward, a protective instinct rising. "She's here to work and live. That's all," he said firmly. Garrett's gaze lingered, appraising her. "Sure," he said slowly, "but I'd keep an eye on her if I were you." There are folks out there who don't take kindly to change or to someone who challenges expectations. With that, he tipped his hat again and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Silas watched him disappear, a knot of unease settling in his stomach. He turned to Juliet, whose eyes held both fire and something else, something unspoken. "Who was that?" he asked. "Someone from my past," she said quietly, her gaze distant. "Or someone who might be. It doesn't matter now. What matters is here now," Silas nodded, though his mind churned with questions. The arrival of Garrett Hollis had added a new layer of tension. A reminder that Juliet's past was not entirely behind her, and that the plains themselves could harbor danger beyond the visible threats of weather and animals. Over the following days, the ranch became a place of subtle conflict. Silas and Juliet navigated not only the physical challenges of the land, but the unspoken push and pull between them. She tested boundaries not maliciously, but with a natural assertion that challenged Silas's routines and assumptions. He found himself both frustrated and intrigued, realizing that her presence demanded a flexibility he had long resisted. Juliet, in turn, sensed the layers of Silas's character, the quiet strength beneath his gruff exterior, the unyielding pride, and the walls built from years of solitude. She began to probe gently, asking questions about his past, about the choices that had brought him to this isolated life. Each answer revealed a mix of vulnerability and stubbornness, a combination that fascinated her, even as it heightened the latent tension between them. Even the land seemed to conspire in their testing. A stretch of fence collapsed during a night of heavy wind. Cattle wandered into a neighboring field, and a sudden illness struck one of the horses. Silas and Juliet worked side by side, their efforts intense and exhausting. Yet every challenge brought with it a quiet realization. Together, they were stronger. Yet the questions that lingered, the secrets, the past, the unknown, were never far behind at night. As they tended the fires and listened to the wind whip across the prairie, Silas caught glimpses of Juliet staring into the dark, her mind clearly elsewhere. He wanted to ask what she was thinking, what haunted her, but hesitated, knowing that some truths could not be forced. The tension between them was no longer just about work or expectations. It was about trust, fear, and the fragile thread of connection that had begun to form. And so the days passed, each one layering uncertainty upon the last. Juliet Thorne was more than Silas had anticipated, more challenging, more formidable, and yet undeniably captivating. Garrett Hollis's visit lingered in the back of their minds, a reminder that the past never fully releases its hold. The land itself seemed to shift, responding to their presence, demanding resilience, patience, and courage beyond what either had anticipated. Silas began to understand that the ranch, his life, and this formidable woman at his side were part of a story that could not be predicted. The plains were vast, unyielding, and full of hidden threats, and so too were the hearts and histories of the people who dared to call it home. In the quiet moments before dawn, as the wind sighed and the stars began to fade, Silas Grayson realized that he had entered a chapter of his life that could not be turned back. The conflict was only beginning, the tensions deepening with every day, the mysteries of Juliet Thorne's past, promising challenges that would test both of them in ways neither could yet imagine. The ranch waited, patient and unforgiving, and the horizon beyond whispered of storms, secrets, and a reckoning yet to come. The wind had turned colder, slicing across the Grayson ranch like a knife as Silas rode the northern fence line, eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. The past weeks had brought challenges in steady waves, the weather, the wandering cattle, and the subtle tension between him and Juliet Thorne, but today the air felt different, heavy with foreboding. Even the horses seemed restless, their ears twitching at every whisper of the wind through the tall prairie grass. Juliet appeared beside him, riding with ease, her large frame a steady presence on the saddle. She did not speak at first, simply scanning the land with a quiet intensity that matched Silas's own. He found himself wondering what thoughts coursed behind her sharp eyes. She had become more than a companion in labor. She was a force he could not ignore. someone whose presence altered the rhythm of the ranch and his own thoughts. "You've been quiet," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Something on your mind?" Juliet shifted in her saddle, her gaze never leaving the distant hills. "Always," she replied simply. "There's always something. This land, it keeps secrets, and I have my own. The winds carry them, if you know how to listen." Silas frowned. He had spent decades mastering the rhythms of the plains, yet Juliet Thorne had arrived like a storm, throwing every assumption into question. Her strength and determination had impressed him, yes, but now he felt the pull of uncertainty like a tether he could not cut. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the restless energy of the animals, in the way the wind twisted around the fences. Later that day, news arrived from town. A rider brought word of Garrett Hollis's return, accompanied by whispers of a land dispute that threatened the Grayson Ranch's northern boundary. Silas's jaw tightened as he listened. Hollis had spoken of Juliet before, his gaze lingering with recognition that Silas did not yet understand. Now it seemed the man's visit was not casual curiosity, but a calculated move, a test of both Silas's resolve and the woman at his side. Juliet stood silently beside him as he read the notice, her hands resting lightly on the railing of the corral. "He's here for a reason," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made Silas pay attention. "I've crossed paths with him before. He doesn't forgive easily, and he doesn't forget. If he's brought trouble to your land, we'll need to face it together." Silas felt a surge of protectiveness, mixed with the gnawing worry that the coming days would challenge more than the fences or the cattle. Hollis represented something deeper, a link to the past Juliet had not fully revealed, a reminder that her journey to the plains had been shaped by forces beyond either of their control. And yet there was a determination in Juliet's posture, a fearlessness that made Silas wonder if he could ever match her strength. Over the next several days, the ranch became a battleground of preparation and anticipation. Silas and Juliet worked from sunrise to sunset, reinforcing fences, checking the herd, and fortifying the barns. Every interaction between them carried a quiet tension, a mix of cooperation and unspoken challenge. She pushed herself, proving her ability to handle the hardest labor. And he pushed back in subtle ways, testing her limits, gauging her resolve. Each day brought them closer, yet also revealed the fragility of trust that had yet to fully form. One evening, as twilight draped the prairie in shades of violet and gold, Juliet confided in Silas a fragment of her past. "Hollis. He's not just anyone," she said, her eyes distant. "Years ago, he tried to take what I had to control me. I escaped, but I know he remembers. And now he's come back, drawn by the land and by you. I didn't want him to find me, but maybe it was inevitable." Silas listened, heart tightening. The danger was no longer abstract. It had become personal, intertwined with Juliet's story and the safety of the ranch. He realized that protecting the land would not be enough. He would have to face Hollis, and in doing so, confront the tension between his own solitude and the connection he felt growing with Juliet. The next morning, Silas woke to the sound of hooves pounding across the yard. He rushed outside to find a small group of men riding toward the ranch, Hollis leading them. The sun glinted off the metal of their weapons, the dust swirling like an omen. Juliet stepped beside Silas, her eyes narrowing. "Stay calm," she said, her voice steady. "We can handle this, but we need to move carefully. They're testing us, measuring our strength." Silas nodded, feeling the surge of adrenaline that always accompanied danger. He mounted his horse, Juliet beside him, both of them a striking sight against the endless stretch of prairie. The ranch seemed to hold its breath, the animals sensing the shift in the air. The moment had come, the confrontation they had both been edging toward. Though neither fully understood what it would demand of them, the riders drew closer, and Hollis's gaze locked on Juliet. Recognition flashed across his face, and Silas could see the history between them in a single glance. There was tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Hollis spoke, his voice carrying over the wind. "I should have known you'd run this far," he said. "But no land is safe from those who want it, and no one forgets the past." Juliet's jaw tightened. "I don't run anymore," she said firmly. and I'm not alone. You'll find that Grayson Ranch is not as easy to take as you think." Silas felt a pulse of fear and pride. This woman, who had arrived like a storm months ago, now stood beside him as an equal, unyielding and determined. The land, the wind, the animals, they all seemed to respond to the tension, the anticipation, the promise of conflict. And yet beneath the adrenaline, a quiet current of something else ran between them, connection forged in shared labor, mutual respect, and the unspoken acknowledgement that their fates were now intertwined. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie, the first challenge came. One of Hollis's men rode too close to the northern fence, and a cow bolted through the broken boards. Silas and Juliet moved with precision, corralling the animal. Their actions synchronized as if they had been doing this together for years. Yet even as they restored order, the threat remained. Hollis and his men were still out there, testing the land, testing them, testing the bond that had begun to form between rancher and bride. Night fell with heavy clouds overhead, the wind carrying the distant sound of hooves and the faint murmur of men on the move. Silas and Juliet sat near the fire, their hands brushing as they passed a bucket of water to the horses. Neither spoke at first. The silence filled with the weight of anticipation and the unspoken questions that lingered. "You know," Juliet said finally, her voice low, "whatever happens tomorrow, we have to trust each other. Not just the land, not just the work, but each other. That's what will get us through." Silas met her gaze, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "I've been alone for too long," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to do this. Trust someone like you. But I'm willing to try." Juliet's smile was faint but steady. "Good," she said, "because tomorrow, everything changes." The wind rose again, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of storms. The cattle huddled in the pens, and the barn doors creaked against the gusts. Silas could feel the weight of the coming confrontation pressing down, knowing that the choices they made in the hours ahead would define the fate of the Grayson Ranch and the fragile trust forming between him and Juliet. Outside, the prairie seemed to whisper secrets only they could hear. The horizon stretched endlessly, a landscape both beautiful and merciless, reflecting the tension that had grown to a breaking point. Hollis and his men were still out there, shadows moving in the distance, and the storm clouds gathering overhead seemed a mirror of the uncertainty in Silas's mind. Juliet stood, brushing dust from her boots, her posture a mixture of readiness and resolve. Silas followed her gaze to the distant hills, to the faint glimmer of movement that hinted at the approach of those who would challenge them. The moment of reckoning was near, the climax of months of tension and preparation, yet the resolution remained beyond reach. Every instinct told them to brace for what was coming, yet neither could predict the twists the plains would demand, as the firelight flickered across their faces. Silas felt the bond with Juliet tighten, unspoken but undeniable. They were not just rancher and bride now, they were partners in survival, allies in a land that tested every ounce of strength, courage, and will. And the storm gathering on the horizon, both literal and metaphorical, promised that the challenges ahead would push them to the edge of everything they knew, forcing them to confront not only outsiders like Hollis, but the fears, desires, and truths that had remained hidden within themselves. The night held its breath, and the prairie waited. Silas, Grayson, and Juliet Thorne stood on the threshold of a turning point, poised between the comfort of what they had built and the danger of what was to come. The wind whispered through the grass, the cattle shifted uneasily, and far off in the distance, shadows moved with intent. Every heartbeat carried the tension of anticipation. Every glance spoke of questions that demanded answers. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. Tomorrow would test their strength, their courage, and their bond. And as they prepared for the coming storm, both in the sky and in the land, they could only wait, each pulse quickening with the promise of danger, discovery, and the hope that together they might survive whatever the plains and their pasts had in store. The first light of dawn spilled across the Grayson Ranch, pale and gold, cutting through the lingering storm clouds that had swept the plains the night before. The wind was calmer now, carrying only the scent of wet earth and grass. But the tension that had gripped the ranch over the past days still lingered in the air. Silas Grayson moved along the fence line, boots crunching in the mud, checking each post and rail. The land bore the marks of turmoil, yet it stood steadfast. Much like the people who called it home, Juliet Thorne emerged from the barn, brushing mud from her hands, her broad frame silhouetted against the rising sun. Her eyes met Silas's, and for a moment neither needed to speak. They had endured the storm together, faced threats from outsiders, and confronted their own fears and doubts. In the quiet morning, the shared hardships and unspoken understanding between them felt like a victory, one that no words could fully capture. "We made it," Silas said finally, his voice low. Though carrying the weight of relief and pride, Juliet's lips curved in a faint smile. "We did. The land, the storm, the challenges, they didn't break us. They made us stronger." Past days had tested them in ways neither could have predicted. Garrett Hollis and his men had arrived under the shadow of threat, attempting to intimidate and claim the northern pasture. But Silas and Juliet had met them head-on. With steady hands and calm determination, Juliet had proven her worth not just as a partner in labor, but as a strategist and an equal in resilience. Silas had learned to trust her instincts, to recognize the sharp intelligence behind her strength, and to allow himself to lean on someone for the first time in years. Hollis had underestimated the unity they shared. By the time he and his men attempted to cross the weakened fence in the pre-dawn light, Silas and Juliet were ready. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Words, not just force, had become their weapons. Hollis recognized the bond between them and the determination that radiated from the ranch, and he retreated begrudgingly, leaving only a promise that the land was not so easily taken. As the tension ebbed, Silas and Juliet walked the fence lines together, repairing the damage left behind, each action deliberate, each glance laden with the silent acknowledgement of what they had endured. The labor itself became a celebration, testament to their shared resilience and the strength of partnership forged in the crucible of adversity. By midday, the ranch seemed to breathe again, as if it too understood that the danger had passed. The cattle wandered calmly in the fields, the horses grazed without anxiety, and the wind whispered softly through the prairie grass. Silas and Juliet paused at the edge of the northern fence, surveying the land that had been threatened, now restored through their combined effort. "You've changed it," Silas said quietly, almost to himself, noting not just the physical repairs, but the subtle shift in the energy of the ranch. "It feels different, stronger." Juliet glanced at him, her eyes bright. "We've changed it," she corrected. "Together, this land, it mirrors us. We tend to it, and it responds. We protect it, and it protects us in return." The weight of past fears lifted, replaced with a sense of accomplishment and the quiet joy of mutual respect. Silas realized that the months of anticipation, doubt, and tension had been necessary not to break them, but to build a foundation far stronger than he had imagined. He looked at Juliet Thorne, this formidable woman who had stepped off a wagon and into his life, and felt a gratitude that ran deeper than words could convey, even in the quiet victory. There were lessons they both carried forward. Trust, Silas understood, was not given freely, was earned through consistency, courage, and shared hardship. Juliet knew that strength alone was not enough. Understanding, patience, and mutual respect were equally vital. And in the shared glances, the silent exchanges, in the work of rebuilding, it had cultivated something far more lasting than temporary relief from danger. It was a bond that would endure. Grounded in experience and choice, by evening, the storm clouds had fully cleared, leaving a sky ablaze with the colors of sunset. Silas and Juliet sat on the porch of the farmhouse, hands brushing occasionally as they watched the prairie stretch endlessly before them. The land was calm, yet it carried the echoes of the challenges they had faced, the lessons learned, and the awareness that future storms would come, but now they would face them together. Juliet turned to Silas, her gaze steady. "You know," she said, The letters didn't prepare either of us for this. You expected a companion, someone quiet and gentle. I expected an easy life. Neither of us got what we imagined, but maybe that's the point. We've grown stronger than we thought we could, and we've done it together. Silas nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. I was wrong about a lot of things, he admitted. Not about the work, not about the land, but about what I needed. I thought I needed someone small, manageable. But you've shown me I need someone who challenges me, who stands beside me, not behind me. Juliet's smile widened, and for the first time in months, Silas felt the tension in his chest release fully. The horizon seemed wider, brighter, as if the land itself celebrated the harmony that had been forged through adversity. The Grayson Ranch, once a place defined by solitude and struggle, now held the promise of partnership, love, and a shared future. As night fell, the stars emerged, scattered across the endless sky like diamonds. Silas and Juliet stepped onto the porch, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the quiet rustle of prairie grass and the distant lowing of cattle. The wind was soft now, carrying not warnings or threats, but the gentle reminder of life continuing, shaped by effort, courage, and connection. Silas realized that the greatest challenge had not been the storm. The cattle, or even Hollisit, had been opening himself to trust, to allow another person into the carefully controlled life he had built. Juliet had forced him to confront that fear, and in doing so, had brought a joy he had not anticipated. In the light of the stars, he understood that the Grayson Ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was a place of belonging, a shared home, and a testament to the strength of partnership. Juliet rested her hand lightly on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of their journey. Whatever comes next, she said softly, we face it together. The land, the storms, the past, it doesn't matter. We've earned this. We've earned each other. Silas nodded, the words he had long struggled to express finally finding their place. Yes, he said. Together, the Grayson Ranch, bathed in the silver light of the moon, felt alive in a way it had not before. The fences, the barns, the open pastures, all carried the mark of hard work, resilience, and the bond between two people who had found strength, not just in themselves, but in each other. The cattle grazed calmly, the horses moved with ease, and the wind whispered softly through the prairie grass, a lullaby for the land and its people. In that moment, Silas and Juliet understood that the trials they had faced, the uncertainty, and the tension had not been obstacles. They had been the forge in which their partnership had been tempered. Every challenge had taught them patience, every storm had tested their courage, and every threat had revealed the depth of their trust. They had learned that love and companionship were not born from ease or expectation, but from shared struggle, mutual respect, and the willingness to stand together when the world demanded it most. The moon rose high, casting a gentle glow over the ranch. Silas and Juliet remained on the porch, watching as the shadows of the night stretched across the prairie. There were still challenges. Ahead storms would come. The land would demand their attention, and life would continue to test them in ways they could not yet predict. But they faced the future with confidence, courage, and the knowledge that together they could weather anything. Juliet's laughter, soft and full, carried across the yard as she recounted a small moment from the morning. And Silas felt a warmth in his chest he had not known in years. The land, once defined by solitude, now resonated with life, connection, and hope. The Grayson Ranch was no longer just a home. It was a testament to resilience, love, and the power of trust. As the night deepened, Silas took Juliet's hand in his, holding it firmly, a silent promise that the past, with all its challenges and uncertainties, was behind them, and the future, with all its possibilities, lay ahead. Together, they would build a life stronger than either could have imagined alone. A life full of hard work, shared victories, quiet moments, and enduring love. And in the gentle hush of the prairie night, the ranch settled into a peaceful rhythm once more. Silas, Grayson, and Juliet Thorne, standing side by side, knew that the trials of the past had prepared them for the life they were about to share. The wind whispered through the grass, the stars watched silently above, and the Grayson Ranch, bathed in moonlight, held the promise of a future forged in courage, strength. In partnership, it was not the life either had expected, but it was exactly the life they needed, and, for the first time in years, both felt entirely, undeniably at home.